Passage in John chapter 10, verse 10, where Jesus is speaking. And he says this, he says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Some translations say, come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. So the question becomes, how is it that you can have that abundant life? Because I am convinced that Christians should be having more fun than anybody else in the entire world. Because our past has been forgiven, our future has been settled, and as a result of that, we should be able to enjoy the present. And so we live each day trying to fulfill our unique purpose that God has for us. And God himself promises to help you accomplish this purpose. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20, it says, now may the God of peace equip you with everything good for doing his will. So we have to learn to rely upon his power rather than just upon what we think that we can do through the flesh. And there's a principle that is woven throughout the entire Bible. It's simply this: you be faithful in the small things, and I will put you in charge of many things. There's a verse in the Old Testament that you might not be familiar with. It's Job chapter 10, verse 8. And Job is speaking to God, and he says, your hands shaped me and made me. That's a really cool verse. Your hands shaped me and made me. Over in Jeremiah, it says something very similar to it. It says that God shaped you. So two different places we find God's word saying that he has shaped us. It's this concept and this idea of individual involvement, of personal attention. In Job 10, verse 9, it goes on and it says this. It says that you molded me like clay. That's how personally involved God is in your life. And so what I want to do with the next few minutes is I just want to talk to you about 5 different ways that God shaped you. And I want to encourage you to write some notes down. You can put it on your paper that you have in your bulletin. If you'd like, you can put it in your phone under a note page. But I guarantee you're going to be able to remember all 5 of these. All right? And it's a very simple acrostic. It's been around for probably 20 or 30 years. I just want you to write the word shape along the left-hand margin. And we're going to see, since it says in Jeremiah and also in Job that God shaped us, how did he shape us? Now, you'll be able to remember these 5. Hopefully, you can use this with a classroom, with a team, with a group of leaders or employees at your work. But this will always stick with you. The S stands for spiritual gifts. So write down spiritual gifts. God has given each and every one of us spiritual gifts. Each of us has probably 3, maybe even 4 spiritual gifts. If you're kind of on the fence on, what are the spiritual gifts or how can I find them, you can read Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, lists a lot of different gifts. In fact, you can even do an online assessment and try to find out what your spiritual gifts are. But to be really honest with you, when you see what your gift is, you know it. Because that's the way God wired you, and that's the way that God made you. So don't feel like you have to have an assessment done. You can just read through the list. So maybe you have the gift of encouragement. Perhaps it's a gift of leadership, or maybe of serving, or of administration, or of hospitality, or of evangelism, or of teaching. Maybe you have the gift of generosity, like that person had at the restaurant last night. They just couldn't sit there any longer without saying, I want to do something for someone else. That's how God wired some of you. Maybe you have the gift of preaching. I don't know what your gifts are, but you know what your gifts are. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 says this: each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. That means when you use your spiritual gift that God's blessed you with, when you use one of those gifts, you are faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms to others. You're being used by God for his glory. Think of it like this. God gave me a gift, not for me, but for you. And God gave you a gift, not for you, but for me. And if I don't use my gift, then I am robbing you. And if you don't use your gifts, then you are cheating me. And that's the way the body of Christ works. We all work together. We have different spiritual giftings, but we come together as Eastside. We come together as the body of Christ, and God uses those things. So the S is for spiritual gifts. The H, let's write down the word heart. God has given you a heart. And you're like, well, sure, that's why I'm alive. That's why it's beating, right? Well, God has given you a heart. And when you think of that word heart, I want you to think about passion. They interviewed 500 TED Talk speakers. And they asked, what's the number one key to success? Out of the 500, the top response was that of passion. What are you passionate about? What do you have a heart for? In other words, what gets you up in the morning? What puts a smile on your face? What makes you sing? What is it that energizes you? That's what your heart is for. After the last hour I was talking to people, they would just come up to me and say, my heart is for this. One girl came up and said, my heart is for the Appalachian region. I go all the way over there once a year on a mission trip. What's your passion for? Now, when I was a kid, I've got to tell you, my heart was for mischief. Any of y'all have a kid whose heart is for mischief? Just put your hand up. It's fine if they're seated beside you. You want them to know that you're on to them, all right? But when I was 15 and my brother was 17, we looked for opportunities and things that we could do. And at that time, my dad, who was a preacher, he was working at a Bible college. And during that particular time, he was the interim preacher at our home church because they were looking for a preacher. And what they did back then was at the end of the worship service, after Dad had preached, Dad would stand out front, an usher would come down, and he would bring him all the cards of people who were first-time visitors. They'd have their name and address, and he'd say, okay, where is the Davis family? The Davis family. The Davis family would reluctantly stand up in the back, and everybody would turn and stare at the Davis family. He'd say, so good to have you. We hope you feel welcome. You know, they're like, okay, thank you, and they'd sit back down. Aren't you glad we don't recognize first-time visitors now and put a spotlight on them, you know? Time you came. Wait, great to have you, sinner, you know. But he would call off different names. Well, my brother and I, we knew that Dad did not know any rock and roll stars at the time. And so I got this novel idea. I said, hey, why don't we try to slide in with a fake address and everything? We'll fill out the whole card, a different rock and roll star every week. It was golden. We made a pact. We would only do one a week. So we thought we could make it last a lot longer. At that church, all the high school kids sat together. So we sat in about 3 rows right up here in the front. So Dad, at the end of the service, people come up, they hand him the cards. Okay, so glad you're here today. All right, Mike and Melissa Miller, are you here? Great, good to have you all. No lie. Pete Frampton. Everybody's looking around. Well, I guess Pete had to leave early. Well, all the kids down front, we're cracking up, laughing. We're dying, right? Week 1 goes past perfectly. Week 2, we write it in, we put a fake address in, everything is cool. Dad gets up there, Alice Cooper. 3 rows of kids are just shaking. I mean, the pews are just shaking right there. We're trying to hold it together in case he looks over, right? And to this day, the favorite line I've ever heard my dad say in all his life, after he says Alice Cooper, I can't wait to get to heaven to watch this on video replay with the Lord. I guarantee you he'll have it queued up because Dad says this. He says, Alice Cooper, is she here? I mean, we cannot stop laughing. But the 3rd week, we pushed our luck too far, as usually was the case with us. And Dad gets the stack of cards. All the high school kids are chomping at the bit, never so excited about church in all their lives. Dad goes through, all of a sudden he comes to one card. He stops. His face turns beet red. He stares at us. He takes the card and puts it in the back of the stack. And I lean over to Jeff and said, I think he's heard of Ozzy Osbourne. It really happened, all of it just like that, and my youth minister will attest to it, and sadly, so will my dad, right? But you have a heart and a passion. Maybe it's for mischief, maybe it's for disobedience, probably is what that was, but you have a heart for something. Now be careful, because sometimes people kind of misdiagnose what their heart is for or what someone else's heart is for. I'll give you an example. Sometimes people will hear me and they say, oh, Dave has a heart for preaching. Well, I do. I really do. But technically, I have a heart to connect people to Jesus. And preaching is just one vehicle that I use. Think of it like this. Howard Schultz, founder of Starbucks Coffee. People would look at him and say, oh, hey, he has a heart and a passion for coffee. I bet you that guy loves coffee. Well, Howard Schultz would tell you, here's what he had a passion for. He had a passion to create a third place other than home or work where people could interact together. That's what his heart's for. And he's been quite successful at it. So my question is, what's your heart for? What's your passion for? I hope if you're a Christ follower that your heart beats for Christ. Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, I want to know Christ. And that's what our heart should be for. But God has shaped us with a heart for something with which we can also do some good. And it's different for every one of us. Maybe you have a heart for the elderly. Maybe you have a heart for young people. We have people in our church, they use their vacation time to go to camp, to work with young kids. Maybe you have a heart for the homeless. Perhaps you have a passion for prayer. Maybe you have a heart for the unborn. Maybe you have a heart for at-risk kids or foster children. Maybe it's for rescuing people from human trafficking. I don't know what you have a heart for. It might not be what your job is, so don't be fooled. You see, there are a lot of people who have a job and they actually have no passion for it whatsoever. It's just a paycheck to them. It's just a job to them. But what do you have a heart for? Don't end up in a career that you don't find fulfilling or meaningful. You say, well, Dave, that would never happen to me. Well, it's happened to 80% of Americans. They say that they don't like their job. You say, there's no way. How in the world could it be that 80% of Americans don't like their job? I'll tell you how. There's another survey that says 4 out of 5 people are in a job that they do not use any of their top 3 passions or gifts. So that's why 4 out of 5 people don't like their job. Did you know that there are people in this church right here who would go to the mat and they would say that I find and derive more joy and fulfillment through what I do as a change maker, as a volunteer here at Eastside, than I do in what I do for over 40 hours and I get paid for. And it's true. And for many of you today, you need to take this card and you need to fill it out in the back and say some areas that you might have a passion for, a way in which God has shaped you, that God could use you, and say, you know what, it's time for me to stop being a spectator and it's time for me to be a participant. And to say, God can use me to be a volunteer within this church. You see, there's something that might be greater than your job, and that's your passion. A career is what you're paid for. A calling is what you're made for. What were you made for? What is your passion? Well, the H is for heart. The A, abilities. You have different abilities. These are natural, innate abilities. You have very little say in them, but you have abilities, and they're different for each and every one of us. This is some innate skill that typically shows up at a very early age. You ever see a group of 7, 9-year-olds and you say, okay, you guys race to the flagpole. 1, 2, 3, go. They take off. About halfway through, one dude just kind of motors past all of them and sails past, beats them by 10 yards. You don't look at that 9-year-old and say, wow, I bet you he's been lifting weights. I bet you he's been on a Stairmaster. I bet he's been doing something. No, he's 9 years old. What happened? God made him quick. God gave him swiftness. It's a natural ability he didn't have any say in. You have natural abilities and they show up at an early age. I love to watch drummers. I was watching Abraham up here. He was rocking out on the drums. He was going down. He's got natural rhythm. He's got that ability. I have terrible rhythm. I love watching Abe because he's one of these guys, it's just very natural for him. But that's not how it is for me because I don't have that. You like to listen to Daniela up here sing or Tyler when he's singing. Why do you do it? Because God gave them a natural ability at that. Maybe you're a great writer. Maybe you have a voice for radio. Maybe you're like me and you have a face for radio. Okay? But God has given us different natural abilities. Maybe it's hand-eye coordination. Maybe you have a very logical mind. Maybe you're a great artist. Maybe you're an awesome storyteller. But you have some innate gift that you have, and you know that you have it. And God gave it to you. Well, let's look at the P, personality. God has given you a personality. Now, there's not a right or a wrong personality, regardless of what your spouse may tell you, all right? There are strengths and there are weaknesses. In fact, there are four main primary types of personality or temperament. In fact, that means that if there are four of those, that there are 16 different combinations if you look at the primary with a different secondary type. And that's the way that God wired us. Rather than getting real confusing with all of those four types or all 16 combinations, we might divide it up and just say that Jesus was the perfect blend of all four, and that we could fall into one of two categories. Either you are an extrovert or you are an introvert. You say, well, how can you tell the difference? Well, an extrovert is energized by being around people. An introvert is energized by being away from people. So if you have free time, the extrovert says, oh man, I got some free time. Let's get a group together. And the introvert is saying, you know what? I got some alone time. I got some me time, right? I can curl up with that book. Go to a university campus and go to the library, and it's very easy to spot. Because in the library, the introverts have gone there to study. The extroverts have gone there to socialize. Correct? My wife and I are worlds apart when it comes to this. We'll go to a party together. We'll walk in at 7 o'clock, and when we get there, I'll say, hey, babe, let's meet back here in 2 hours at the front entry. Okay, sounds good. 9 o'clock, we meet back. We tell everybody goodbye. We start walking to the car. I say, oh, babe, that was an awesome party. She says, oh, that was incredible. I'll say, hon, what did you do? She'll say, well, I sat down on the couch with Lori and Debbie, and for 2 hours, we just talked about family and just caught up on things, and we never moved from that couch for 2 hours. And I'm thinking, what a waste. And she says, what did you do, hon? I said, well, you know what? 2 hours time, I think there were 45 people at the party. I hugged, high-fived, or shook hands with all 45 people. Boom! And she's walking to the car thinking, I just married the most shallow loser in all the world, all right? But that's the way that God wired us. There's not a right or a wrong. Look in the New Testament, the disciples. Peter and Andrew are brothers. Peter and Andrew both have the spiritual gift of evangelism, all right? But Peter did it with groups, with large groups, with masses. Andrew did it one-on-one and with smaller groups. But both of them used their gifts, and both of them used their personality. In fact, every single time you see the name of the name of Andrew appear in the Gospel of John, every single time he is bringing an individual or a small group to Jesus Christ. God can use the way he wired you. The psalmist said it like this in Psalm 139, verse 16. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. So God made you with the personality that he gave you, and he made you that way for a purpose. But here's our problem. We spend most of our lives trying to be copies, and we forget that God made us each as originals. And we try to be like somebody else. Hey, if you want to be like somebody else, then try to be like Jesus Christ. You try to imitate him. God says, I shaped you with a personality for a purpose. And he knows what he's doing. Well, the E, put this in your phone or on your paper, experiences. God has given you different experiences. What do I mean by that? Well, just doing life. You've had educational experiences. You've had vocational experiences. You've had travel experiences. You've had relational experiences. Some of those relationships have gone really great. Friendships that have lasted for years and years. Others of them have gone south and sour after some time. And it's true, all of the different experiences that you go through, that God deepens you and he challenges you. And he works off those rough edges and he makes you appreciate when things go well. Maybe you heard about the soldier that was over in the Iraq conflict, and while he was over there representing the United States, he got a letter, a snail mail letter from his girlfriend. He was so excited when they gave it to him. He recognized the handwriting, couldn't wait to read it. He began reading the letter, and the more he read, he realized it was a Dear John letter, and she was breaking up with him. I mean, it just hurt. But when he came to the end of the letter, to add insult to injury, she put, P.S., please return my favorite picture of myself, as I would like to use it in the county newspaper for my engagement photograph. You talk about kicking a dude when he's down. But all his buddies came to his rescue. And you know what they did? They went through all of the soldiers and they collected from each soldier one picture of a young woman. They filled up an entire shoebox with them, and then they put her picture in the middle of the hundreds of pictures, and they had their friend write this note. Please find your picture and return the rest. For the life of me, I can't remember which one you were. We love that, right? But there are times when you go through those painful experiences, and there seems to be differing degrees of the pain we experience. And we say, okay, Lord, you say everything happens for a reason. You say that somehow you're going to work good out of this bad. I'm waiting. And you wait. And it might be a disease, a diagnosis, a divorce. But it hurts, and in desperation, you say, okay, Lord, this is one of those experiences. How are you going to work some good out of this? But one thing I've found is that when you have been through something, you can minister to people in a way that no one else can. When someone in my church goes through a miscarriage, I can hug them, I can encourage them. But when somebody comes up who has had a miscarriage or multiple miscarriages, it goes to a whole nother level. And they're able to minister to that person in a deeper way because they can look them in the eyes and they have this heart-to-heart connection because they can say, I know how you feel. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, Paul says, praise be to the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. And God takes all of the things that you have gone through, and he enables you and he equips you based on those experiences so that you can minister to other people.